All right. Well, we have a very special guest today, and I'm so excited because I have been actually devouring your content. A man who has no filter, Zack Peter. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you guys for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. And of course, we've been following the Lively and Baldoni matter. And I've been just not only watching your podcast, which has been excellent, you've been at the epicenter of this thing all along, but also reading as many articles and things as I can. And I always thought to myself, if I could talk to Zack, because I'm a lawyer and I like to argue, I was going to say I'm going to take Team Lively, and let's mix it up. Let's get in an argument here because I know you're Team Baldoni. But the more I read and the more I learn and the more I listen to, I don't want to be Team Lively. I think that's pretty hard target to take on.
I think every day Blake Lively is not wanting to be Blake Lively. Like, I think she even wants to back out of this because it's become so cringy at this point.
Yeah, it's really become difficult for her. And it's funny because you were talking about these subpoenas that they issued. So the Team Lively issued subpoenas trying to get phone records from Baldoni, and Friedman came out and said, well, they're way too broad. I mean, you can't just go on a fishing expedition. And of course, in our line of work, we do a lot of that where you have to assert, it's called the right to privacy. You don't have a right to just pry into somebody's private information unless it's narrowly tailored to what the lawsuit is. So you have to, look for something that's relevant. You can't just look for everything under the sun. I think you were making that point as well. But it just seems to me
Unless
like,
you're on a fishing expedition.
yeah,
Unless you're trying to find something incriminating to use against them.
yeah. And so if you are on a true fishing expedition, then you've got some problems. But the law just doesn't allow that. I mean, in California, for example, and this is true probably in most jurisdictions, you have a right to privacy, and the court's going to cut that back. But it just seems to me that the Team Lively side has been caught really quite flat-footed on this whole thing, and yet they're the plaintiffs. They're the ones who had all the time in the world to prepare this before they filed. So I know you've talked about this, but what is your view of that?
Yeah, that's the thing that was the strangest to me was she claims to have, had all of this ready even when the initial New York Times article was published, right? They claim that they published this information because they had thousands and thousands and thousands of pages that they reviewed of evidence, and that's why they felt confident publishing this article. I didn't believe that there was, even 50 pages of information that they reviewed, but that's my own it's my own personal opinion, but it's where's the 1,000 documents that they reviewed then if, because we haven't seen any of it aside from these text messages that were presented. And we now see that those text messages were lacking the full thread. They were lacking context. They didn't give us the full story. So I don't think she has a very strong, I mean, and me, dumb legally blonde Elle Woods over here, I'm not a lawyer, I'm just a podcaster, but if I can put these pieces together, then it's strange to me that they're even still going so hard with this whole lawsuit.
Yeah, it really is. And so I want to talk a little bit about the fact that you early on, like from the beginning, your spidey senses were tingling about this whole claim that Lively brought. And of course, now that everybody's on the Baldoni side and the evidence has come out, a lot of people I think are saying, "Oh, I was with Blake Lively all along." It's like I'm not so sure, but you were.
You mean Baldoni?
Yeah, Baldoni. I think, but you were suspicious of this whole Blake Lively claim in the beginning, and I was just curious, what is it that you saw? What were you seeing that made you feel that way?
What's so funny, and this is something that people haven't picked up on, is I covered the drama, like when there was speculation of like, are Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively not getting along? Back then, when people were digging up all the interviews, I think at one point I even like defended her, and I was like, I think people are just dragging this out and like digging up every single interview and taking it out of context, and making her a lot worse than what she is. I'm sure she's a diva. We've heard these rumors on set for years. But when the lawsuit first came up, or when the New York Times article first dropped, there were just a few red flags that really stood out to me. And as somebody that covers pop culture and knows the news very well, for a while, I even, was a contributor on an entertainment website that I used to write for that's really popular. Um, and so I know how the game works, and I know how editors like to tweak things to boost SEO and whatnot. And so one thing that I noticed with the New York Times, though, with this article specifically, is there was no more paywall. And normally every New York Times article has a paywall, or you have to at least enter an email address to gain access to the information. None of that. And then the lawsuit, I mean, I'm sure you guys know, like, lawsuits are not typically for, the average Joe, are not easy to just obtain. You can't go on the New York Times website and immediately have a button that says download the PDF and read it for yourself. Like, that's not standard. And so, as somebody that's covered a number of different celebrity legal scandals, um, I was shocked that they were just putting this out there. So I thought, one, I feel like they want this to be easily accessible for people. That's why they removed the paywall and put the PDF up. But then if you actually read through the article, they kept making these allegations about, like, I couldn't dispute the harassment claims because that's her own experience, and I don't know, I didn't see any evidence of the harassment presented in that article, but the allegations I can't dispute until we have that play out, right? But at least from the smear campaign, the way that they were positioning it to me was strange, because I was like, that's not how I remember it going down. Because again, at one point I was even defending Blake, because what I remember happening is it took one interview that went viral with this woman that complimented her on her little bump, and then Blake Lively responded and was like, well, congrats on your little bump. And people are like, oh, is Blake Lively, a diva? Is she rude? Is she whatever? And then that kind of blew it up, and everybody started sharing their stories and video clips, and that's ultimately what took down her reputation. But in this world, in pop culture, in Hollywood, like, the news moves so fast that I feel like people had already forgotten about that and didn't care about the story anymore. And then now it's only been brought up again because of the fact that she decided to launch this complaint.
Right. Yeah. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And you're right. I can't even read a report about inflation on the New York
Yeah.
Times without having to pay some money or something.
Let alone an expose on Justin Baldoni and Blake Lively. It was crazy. And there was just no evidence of the alleged smear campaign. My memory served me pretty well in how I remember it going down, and it's not how they laid it out. And then even with the text messages that they published, to me, I was like, I feel like this is lacking context. I don't think we're getting the full story, and I'm highly skeptical.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because you had mentioned that I think Johnny Depp's attorney spoke out,
Yeah.
and his opinion, I think you said something about, he was kind of gave a reserved opinion, which is what lawyers do because we say, well, we have to see both sides and we have to see the evidence, and we know that not everything that's out there in the public becomes admissible evidence because the evidence code, you have to, a bunch of hoops you have to jump through for something to be used as evidence. But then you see that video of them dancing, the video and the audio, and it's completely different from the way that Blake Lively characterized it. And I'm thinking, ooh, I don't know how you get out from under that one. As a lawyer, I mean, you could skew it, you could try to, spin it, but
Which
it
they
seems,
did. I think her attorney issued a statement saying, "Oh yeah, this tells us this is exactly what we said it was." And I just remember being like, "What?" Like, my eyes and my ears are not deceiving me, because what I'm watching here, and then the written description of how they explained this going down. And the thing is, I don't think they expected him to have the level of evidence that he has, right? In her complaint, she said there was no audio being recorded, and they didn't realize he actually had a mic on him and all of the audio was being recorded.
so this is an important point, and this is where lawyers are at a huge disadvantage because we start a case and a client tells us things and we believe our clients, but you don't necessarily know what the evidence is out there. They didn't know that they had this videotape. What do you it's hard as a lawyer because you want to state the claim as best you can, but man, you didn't know that the evidence was out there. I mean, that's happened to us, how many times, Stuart, where a client comes in and they just overstate something, and then you put it in a complaint, and then you find out, oh, there's evidence that directly contradicts that the client didn't tell you about.
Zach, the thing that hits me on this type of case where you have these very famous people suing each other. Normally, when we file a complaint with the civil court, our audience, our target audience, is a judge and the judge's lawyers that they have at the courthouse there that are going to review our complaint and check off the boxes to make sure we've got our causes of action right and that they can accept it as a valid lawsuit. And then, of course, our other target audience is the defendant that we're suing, and that we want them to read it. Here, you've got a first amended petition or a complaint that was filed by Baldoni recently, and then apparently Blake Lively, they're saying they're going to also do an amended petition. The target audience is you, Zach. It's the YouTubers. It's the media. It's that this is a different type of lawsuit. They're filing these things so that the court of public opinion will read this stuff and come to a conclusion. And they're both doing a PR fight to make each other look bad. My question to you is, how do these people resolve this? This is going to be millions and millions of dollars in attorney's fees and losses for future projects to come. If you were advising either one of these people, how do they extricate themselves from what's going on here?
I mean, I feel like there are two things that are going on here. There's the PR crisis and then there's the legal crisis. And I feel like right now, Blake Lively has both, right? Like, she's not looking good PR-wise. The public is absolutely turned on her and she no longer has control of the narrative. And then I think in court, she's getting buried, right? He's releasing evidence left and right. To me, red flags that she wants the gag order. It's gag orders and filing to dismiss the case. Like, all of those things are standard, but like, it's one thing after another with her. She wants to dismiss this case. She wants to have the gag order. She's asking for extensions to amend her complaint. She's asking for an additional 2 weeks. And my thing is, it's like, if you have the truth and you have the evidence that you claim that you have, why do you need an additional 2 weeks to then amend your complaint? Like, it should have been a quick amendment. When Baldoni amended his complaint, it was fast. So I think legally, my personal opinion, I defer to you guys as the experts, but legally, I think she should just settle, because the more information that comes out, the worse it gets for her and the more incriminating it is against her. I feel like it's a battle of the egos, and they likely will try to fight this as far as they can. So legally, I think she needs to just settle, bow out, and take the loss. And then
how
PR wise,
do that though? I mean, this is the devil's in the details. I mean, do her lawyers approach his lawyers and say, "Hey, we want a confidential settlement," and he's going to say, "I don't want a confidential settlement."
I mean, I think at this point, money talks, and Brian Friedman will take a real fat paycheck to avoid, having to go to court. Because I mean, there are obviously things that'll come out about Baldoni that won't look good either. But I mean, he's, as Ben Chu, who represented Johnny Depp, as he said, like, this is a really aggressive campaign that Brian Friedman is launching here, and understandably so. So I mean, I don't know. Like, I would think just find a way to settle privately. Baldoni, from what we've seen, seems like he's a fairly reasonable enough guy that he won't try to drag it out any further, considering, I mean, he kept his mouth shut. She had him in the basement during the premiere of the film, and he never shared that information. And we would have never known that. We would have never known about Deadpool and Nice Pool parodies that were done in the movie. Like, all these details were completely kept from us until this lawsuit came forth.
One last thing that I'll add here, and I remember just a couple of years ago, I was going through YouTube and I saw an interview with Blake Lively, and there was a young reporter. It's a male reporter, and he was just excited to be there, asking her some questions. And he asked her a wardrobe question, and she really took him. I remember thinking, it was like, wow, she was really harsh on him, and he was just a young guy. He was just excited to be there, and she kind of was pulling the card of he was being a sexist, or he was asking her questions that her male counterparts don't have to answer. I thought he was just excited, and he was asking her about some fashion tips and how she felt about the what she was wearing for the movie. And she took it to a place, and I remember at the time, and of course now that all this has come up, that's what I remember now. I remember she was really hard on this very young kid who I don't think was trying to be malicious to her in any way.
Yeah, and as somebody that's interviewed, a number of different types of people, right? From lawyers, business professionals, celebrities, I can immediately read that Blake Lively, I've never met her in person, but just from what I see of her in interviews, I can read that she has a very intimidating presence. And as an interviewer, it is really challenging to stay in control of the interview when you have somebody with that sort of cadence and just, dominating energy, right? Because as the interviewer, you have to be the one that's driving the train. And when you have a guest like that, which I have interviewed people like her, it can be very challenging. So what you have to do is match their energy and almost out alpha them so that they kind of not buckle, but they kind of like, let their guard down a little bit. And then you're able to, run with the interview and let them feel comfortable enough to open up. But with Blake, what I've noticed, and as you mentioned, she seems to really bulldoze interviewers when she's doing these things, when she's in a press junket. We saw it with the woman with the little bump interview. Turns out she ends up, I believe she's married to a man that also interviewed Blake Lively. And that interview has come forth where she's forcing him to drink a martini in the interview. And you can tell he's really uncomfortable. Because it was like 8:30 in the morning and she was trying to also promote her husband's aviation gin. So she's like, here, try the martini. Drink it now. You said that you wanted to take a shot. Drink it now. And she's like making him drink this on camera. And it's very uncomfortable. So I think, yeah, she just has that need to be in control always. And if that's how she is in an interview, I can only imagine what she's like on set.
It's ironic too that she would go after somebody about the wardrobe when, by her own admission, she took over all of the wardrobe decisions on
Yeah.
with us in other movies too. So it actually would be a valid question. I mean, just logically speaking.
What about, I had heard, Zach, maybe you could fill me in on this. I had heard that they were within just a couple weeks of starting to shoot with Baldoni, and that's when all the demands started coming in for script rewrites and wardrobe changes. And apparently Blake had not even read the book, which he wanted her, Baldoni wanted her to read the book for context as she's coming into it. Is there any truth to any of that?
Yeah, I don't believe she ever read the book, which was jarring when it came out in the lawsuit. I mean, that's what he's claiming. We don't know that as fact. That's just the allegation that he's made. But he does back it up with like one thing about Baldoni is when you see the evidence that he puts in there, like it really does help color the full picture. And so, with him, he has text messages going back and forth with other producers where they reference the fact that she didn't read the book. And so that, to me, shows that supports that he's telling the truth. Whereas a lot of the claims that she's making, we either don't have anything to back it up or we have her allegations versus like the footage, which obviously are very conflicting. So, yeah, I heard that from day one, she didn't want to go in. I think it was like a 15-minute drive to go into her fittings, and she didn't want to do that. So she would run up the wardrobe budget by having them shuttle all of the clothes to her so that she could try them on at home. And then I believe they like blew through the budget just with her wardrobe, and then Baldoni's wardrobe. They completely blew through the entire wardrobe budget before they were even able to buy wardrobe for other actors on the show, or in the film rather. So it's just, you can tell from the very beginning, she's very much a bulldozer. And then one of the latest interviews that's been going around was I believe it was 2022. It was a woman summit. I think it was Variety, and they were interviewing her. And in it, she talks about how when she's trying to land the role, she's trying to get cast in a movie or in a project, she plays very, very easy to work with. And then once she's actually on the film, then she fights for authorship and she wants to make sure that she does have control of the project. But she says that she doesn't like to lead with those cards up front because she doesn't want people to think that she's difficult. But in her head, she has so much more to bring to the table than just being an actress, which is just funny. And I've heard, people compare it, and they're saying that's like hiring a plumber to come and fix your toilet, and then he comes over and suddenly he starts giving you interior design advice for your living room, and it's like, I didn't ask you for that. I asked you to drain the toilet.
Yeah. I remember talking to a psychologist a couple years ago, and this person was making the point of people will tell you who they are. All you have to do is listen. And that's what that reminds me of. It's like, oh, well, there you have it. She was telling people who she was.
Well, how is her husband? I know he's been also drawn into this case, and I'm not clear on how he's drawn into it, but he obviously has deep pockets. And of course, if this did go to a jury, which both sides, it would be mutually assured destruction if they end up in front of a jury. But there's deep pockets there. But can you tell us a little bit about how her husband ended up in this case, Zach?
Well, that's, I think, the part that people are so kind of perplexed by. And it's starting to seem like a theme with the two of them, mostly with her husband, Ryan Reynolds, that he has a tendency to kind of take over control of the project. And I think, we've seen him. I mean, now that we have this nice pull skit that he wrote into the most recent Deadpool versus Wolverine film, and we see how he was kind of just trolling Justin Baldoni, I think that in and of itself is a really concrete example, because normally an actor doesn't get to just kind of riff and add in these scenes that really don't add any real layer to the story or the plot, or and this is an action flick. It's Deadpool and Wolverine, that like having this random scene trolling this male feminist nice pool character with a man bun very similar to Justin Baldoni, like it didn't make sense. And now that we know that he was deliberately just trying to troll him, it shows you how much control he has on these film sets. And so when it comes to It Ends With Us, it appears at some point he started putting some sort of like creative input, and it's unclear exactly when he enters the picture or how far ahead he was involved. But it seems like when Blake's wanting to rewrite some of the dialogue and some of the scripts, he started to insert himself at some point. And I think a lot of the speculation, at least online, is that there maybe was something he sensed. So how he and Blake Lively initially met was on the set of the Green Lantern. And at the time, he was married to Scarlett Johansson and she was dating her Gossip Girl co-star, Penn Badgley. So they were both committed at the time that they worked on this film together. And shortly after the film wrapped, they had each split from their partners and then began dating, which made people think they probably fell in love, maybe had some sort of affair on set. So part of the speculation now is that something that Ryan was maybe insecure about, considering how he met her? They always say how you get him is how you lose him. And so was there possibly some sort of insecurity? Was there, him needing to make sure that her relationship with Justin Baldoni didn't go too far, because maybe there were some concerns, and that's why he inserted himself so strongly into this film, because he definitely had a strong role, from helping her rewrite some of the scenes to even the promotion, which was so strange. He was doing interviews and skits to promote It Ends With Us, and typically you don't have your husband come and do promotion for a film that he's not even a part of.
Yeah. It is very odd. And what was the issue with I know one of Lively's big beefs is this whole producer credit stuff, and which doesn't, I don't even understand the issue. I don't understand why she wants it. It doesn't seem as though she should have it, but what was the producer credit issue?
So it's it's called a PGA mark. And so it's a very like special coveted type of producer credit that basically says you were essentially the main producer. You did majority of the work. Like you are like, it's not like a vanity credit, which is what she was given at the initial start of the film, which most lead actresses in her realm would get, like a standard slap your name on it to say that you're a producer, even though you're not like really a producer and you're not giving much aside from lending your name and your face to the film. But in this case, she wanted the PGA mark and was requesting that everybody that was working on the film write letters to the association to approve this credential that she wanted, which again is just, it's another accolade on, another notch on the belt. It's another accolade that I don't know if she wants to get into producing or what she thinks this was going to bring her some sort of benefit in, but she fought very hard. And then we see Justin Baldoni and Jamie Heath, the other producer from Wayfair, saying, like, refusing. They're like, no, this is actually something we don't believe. As the real producers of this film, the ones that have
Right.
worked on it for the last 2 years and purchased the rights and do all of the actual work, we don't believe that she's entitled to that. And then, what's alleged in his complaint is that she went to Sony and was threatening to either stop filming or to not promote the film if she didn't get this. So then we see in his complaint the letter that is written to their attorneys that are saying, we're signing this letter. Here's a copy of the letter. We're saying that we're endorsing her to get this PGA mark, but we want to make it very clear to our legal team here in this email that we signed this letter under duress and we don't support her getting this PGA mark, which she ultimately did get.
Oh, she does end up with it at the end of the day. So it's just another example of kind of her strong arming, it sounds like, Baldoni and his partner.
Zach, if there was let's assume there's a settlement here, and you get Blake Lively or Justin Baldoni that comes to you and says, what's my path forward here? How do I rehab my reputation? Is there a path to rehabbing either one of these people's reputation? Do they go away for 10 years? Do they go away for 5 years? What would be your prescription for either one of these people, or for both of them, if they came to you and asked you, how do I resolve this issue and with the public and get back into producing or acting or whatever it is that I would like to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I mentioned, the news cycle is so fast and the audience is so fickle that and everybody loves a comeback story, right? It's all about how you present it to the public. And so I think if Blake Lively came to me and was like, what do you think I should do? I would probably say, one, you need to divorce your husband and let him take the fall for all of this. Say he was jealous, say he was controlling, say that it was an unhealthy, toxic relationship. She also just had a baby going into the film. So say I had mommy brain, my hormones were all over the place, I had postpartum depression. Like, say anything that makes your judgment and your headspace not in the right space. To say, yes, I was probably terrible to work with, but I wasn't my best self, and try to make an excuse for your terrible behavior, right? And the easiest thing you can do is play the mom card, play the mommy card. I just had a baby, my hormones were all over the place. Like, just lean into that, because you can garner sympathy from the audience through that, because that is very relatable to be a new mom, to be insecure about your body because you just had a baby, which we see a lot of those insecurities come up with the fat shaming allegations. And lean into that, leave Ryan Reynolds, divorce him, say that, he's the one that was controlling and was, encouraging me to push forth this lawsuit. I didn't even really want to do it, and say that the relationship was just toxic and unhealthy. Because there was, I think Scarlett Johansson, who's his ex-wife, she's kind of alluded to he's kind of controlling and has a strong ego. And some of his exes have had things to say that aren't the greatest. So it wouldn't be hard to sell the public on that narrative. And then go dead for two years, maybe 1 year, right? Maybe do a charity event here or there to keep your face fresh, start to align yourself with more philanthropic causes, and then pivot from, I want to take down Justin Baldoni, to, my mission is really just to make sure that people, and women specifically, feel safe in the workplace. Like, make that your whole mission, is to get SAG or somebody to make some sort of amendment when it comes to intimacy scenes and intimacy coordinators, look like you're trying to do some sort of social justice work.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great path forward for her.
And I think Baldoni will be fine. I think that if anything, this helped him. I mean, you're going to have a fraction of people that probably want nothing to do with him, but I think overwhelmingly majority of the public is going to continue to support him as we see them rallying around him now.
I have not really paid attention to this story all that much. I've just seen snippets, and my compassion is with him. I don't know why, but it is. I feel bad for the guy, and I feel like, he invest a large amount of his own personal money into this film as well. I mean, aren't those issues going on?
Yeah. Just hearing his story and seeing how, this film dates back like 5 years when he first met the author, Colleen Hoover. And, even in their correspondence, she's a big fan of his. She, believes in his mission. He wanted to make sure that 1% of all revenue that came in from the film was donated to help survivors of DV. That you can just tell, like, he doesn't seem like this bad guy that, Blake wants to make him out to be with what we're reading in her complaint. But I mean, it's possible in Hollywood that people are not who they say they are, but I just don't get that from what we've seen of Justin Baldoni. Just let alone, I mean, the isolated incident of him being in the basement, and he never said anything, never called her out, never spoke poorly about her during the press tour. And then now we see the photos, and you see him in the basement, and him and his team are trying to make the best of it. And they're laughing as they're sitting on top of these cases of Dasani water. Like, they're making the best of a really bad situation, and never came public with this information until they had to.
That's a really good point. I remember seeing that everybody's dressed up in these ball gowns and they're sitting on top of these cases of water. It's sad, but it's funny. I mean, it's funny in perspective, I guess. But
yeah,
one of the things I think that really infuriate people about Lively is just people don't like when other people, especially celebrities, are hypocritical. And so you come out with something that sounds bad, and then the evidence is coming out and it seems opposite. And one of the things that we've always done in our cases is you have to be the one to tell on yourself.
Right.
And so if we have a bad fact in the case, you better be the one to tell the judge or jury that before the other side does, because there's nothing worse than having the other attorney stand up and say, well, that sounds great, but here's what they didn't tell you. And you're like, oh boy, here it comes. And you've had experience with that.
I have.
mean, we both have,
Yeah.
but you had a story about that in particular.
Yeah, no, I same thing Keith just said. We used to appear at hearings, and I remember a lawyer on the other side got up and said that was one of the finest arguments I've ever heard from my opposing counsel. But here's what he didn't tell you. But that leads me in this case. It sounds like it's pretty much a frivolous complaint that Lively has filed. So is she going to go through and basically say everything I filed is not accurate? Well, if that's the case is over. And so I'm not sure that she's going to be able to point out all of the things that I'm doing wrong here. I think there's some PR things that they could do better, obviously, but she certainly does. She looks terrible. And it's terrible if she actually isn't terrible. What if she isn't what she's being portrayed as, and she has a little bit of innocence going on here? She's not winning that fight for sure.
No. If that were true, then she's like long down the road of losing that one, I would think. But
yeah, and just the timeline and the evidence, like none of it makes sense with the story that she was trying to tell us. And my own sort of theory was I don't think she ever planned on bringing forth the lawsuit. I think she thought that the CRD complaint and the New York Times article was going to be enough to bury him, and he wasn't going to get up fighting, and he wasn't going to fight back, because from what we've seen now, he didn't fight back throughout the entire time that he was working with her, right? So much so that he was like, okay, I'll sit on the Dasani water and I'll chill on these crates and take some selfies and just make the best of the situation. And then it gets so much worse when then you learn that there was a woman with a terminal illness who was so excited to meet Justin Baldoni, and he brought her to the film in a wheelchair, and then you see him with photos of them together at the premiere in the wheelchair, and then you find out she put the lady in the wheelchair in the basement. Like, it gets so bad when you peel back the layers of the onion that there's really no redemption. And the thing too is, it's like, I don't think she even knew all of these details or cared, but the fact that he fought back so hard, understandably, considering he's claiming his innocence, it's wild to see how this is all going to ultimately play out.
This may be too easy of a question, but I'm curious if Blake Lively could get in a time machine and go back a few months. Do you think that she would have moved forward with all of this?
No, I honestly don't think she ever planned to. I think, maybe it's being spearheaded by Ryan Reynolds, who just has this vendetta because maybe he is trying to defend his wife and believes her allegations. But then it brings into question, well, if this really did happen to your wife and she's as traumatized as she claims to be in her lawsuit, then why are you poking fun at it in the nice pull Deadpool skit, right? But if that is the case, then I think I really think, well, I guess this is more of a question for you guys. So when she started, it was just the CRD complaint that she filed in California, but her lawsuit was filed in New York. And I think that was kind of the confusion, because a lot of people were saying a CRD complaint was kind of the precursor to a lawsuit that she was going to bring forth. But why would you file the CRD complaint in California when you ultimately ended up filing your lawsuit in New York?
I would have to, well, probably for a couple of reasons. One, there might be a jurisdictional issue. So because of the parties you're suing, you probably, one or more of them, you just can't get jurisdiction in California. So you have to sue in another jurisdiction. And then they, for whatever reason, wanted to go to federal court. The CRD is a requirement. You have to file that before you can file a civil complaint in California. That's under state law. But they're not going under that. They're going under federal law. And, usually the plaintiffs always do forum shopping. So they're thinking, what's the best forum for this? Where am I going to get the best judge? Where am I going to get the best, sympathetic jury? So they might have thought that federal court in New York would be a better forum for them. Of course, as far as the court of public opinion, that hasn't helped. And it may not help legally either. But they must have had some thought that was going to be a better jurisdiction for them.
It may also be, and I haven't looked at this, but it may be a forum selection clause could be an issue. I mean, was there any contracts that were signed here, and did they mandate that any filings pertaining to the employment would have to be in a particular jurisdiction?
Well, the thing is, the film was shot in Jersey, and she lives in New York. So most of this took place on the East Coast.
So
I know Baldoni lives in California, though.
Yes, the epicenter of where the actions took place, and that's probably what's driving this.
Well, and
Yeah.
then I mean, federal case out of New York, I would assume that part of the reason they went that route is to prevent cameras from being in the courtroom.
Yeah,
Because
probably.
they don't want another Johnny Depp Amber Heard situation.
No, absolutely not. And that might have been the sole driving focus right there. But when you go to federal court, I mean, federal judges don't mess around.
They don't mess around.
I mean, they run a
Yeah.
very tight ship,
Yep.
and you got to be on your game.
Well,
and
didn't the federal judge here just recently, a day or two, didn't he or she chastise the lawyers for making this so public? And wasn't there something along those lines, Zach?
A couple of things. Yeah. So in the initial pretrial hearing that happened, was it last Tuesday or maybe the Tuesday before? So in that hearing, the judge was like, specifically to Brian Friedman, because they were saying like he's going on interviews. He did like a whole expose on Megyn Kelly's show. He published a whole website with literally the whole timeline and all this evidence against them. And so the judge is like, no more of these games. Like, let's, you can talk to the press, but you can't be doing these interviews that could potentially taint the jury. And then you can tell that this is a no nonsense judge, though, because so after Justin Baldoni amended his lawsuit against the New York Times, after all of the internet sleuths kind of came out and dug up all of this metadata in the New York Times article to show that they had been working on this article for some time prior to her filing, which happened on December 20th. And the article was published on December 21st. But I believe they had some of the media that was uploaded to that article, or that was published in that article, dated back to like the end of October, I believe it was, in early December. So it showed that they had been working on this for some time. So Baldoni then amended his complaint against the New York Times to include that info. And then that's when Blake Lively's team said, oh, well, we want to amend our complaint as well. And their deadline was actually today, Valentine's Day. And then they were asking for an extension, and the judge is like, okay, well, why do you need an extension? And they didn't really have a reason. So the judge is like, okay, I'll give you the weekend, but I'm not giving you until March 5th, which is what they wanted, was 2 extra weeks. And it's like, you haven't told me why you need this extra time. So no, I'm not going to grant this for you. That's ridiculous.
So these lawyers are not going to be able to take their significant others out tonight for Valentine's Day. That's what
No.
I'm hearing.
They're going to be working all weekend to make sure this is ready come Tuesday.
Yeah, and that's federal court for you. I mean, they're tough, and so that's very interesting.
But so back to my initial question, though, is there a legal strategy for filing the CRD complaint in California? It doesn't seem like she ever intended on filing the actual lawsuit in California. So what would the reason, or what could there have been a reason for filing that CRD complaint?
Well, one reason could be that she planned on filing a lawsuit in California, and then they changed their mind. And so they did the CRD complaint first, because that's what you must do before you can get your letter to sue in California. And then they shifted direction. The other thing could be what Friedman's lawyers arguing, what you alluded to, I think earlier, is that she never intended to file.
Yeah.
And so she files a complaint, she releases it to the press, and she wasn't going to file, but then something, possibly forced her hand, or she felt like she had to get out even more facts. And Friedman is trying to argue that complaint, she never intended to file the lawsuit because he's trying to get out from under the litigation privilege, because they're countersuing for defamation, which you normally cannot do when you're involved in a litigation, because all the allegations that are said in a litigation is covered by the litigation privilege. So you can drag your opponents through the mud and defame them left, right, and every which way, and not sue them. But Friedman's trying to get around that by saying that this complaint was filed in California. And it kind of makes sense. It was filed in California, but you file the lawsuit in federal court in New York. You never intended to file a lawsuit in California after you filed that CRD complaint. And therefore, we should be able to sue you for the defamation and slander that you did in that complaint that was then released to the press. And
because those are also confidential complaints, correct? Like those are not something that the public can access without it being leaked to the New York Times.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're allowed to file that complaint with the CRD and let that play out. And if you're happy with that resolution, you never have to file a lawsuit. But you can't file a lawsuit without filing that first.
What does the CRD complaint do exactly?
They research it.
Okay, so they look into it and then they hold the other party accountable should they find cause?
Correct. Yeah. So they can actually come up with a remedy, where, either somebody's employment's restated or they have to pay, an amount in damages. I think it's used a lot in like wage and hour cases where somebody wasn't paid what they were supposed to be paid. So it's an administrative body.
You have to exhaust your administrative remedies,
Yeah.
and it's normally you just get a right to sue letter that comes from it. So it's a box that must be checked prior to filing the lawsuit. And you almost always end up filing the lawsuit. Here, obviously not. And I think Keith is right. I think they were doing it so that they might have some type of litigation privilege for everything that was being said during that time period. But generally, it's a very most people understand that when you are exhausting these administrative remedies, you're not going to get a resolution. You're simply going to get a letter back saying, hey, we've reviewed this. You now have a right. You've complied with the regulations. You now have a right to sue in state court. And then almost all plaintiffs at that point go forward and file in state court.
Right, which she didn't wait for any sort of response to that letter and instead ended up filing her lawsuit in New York, which makes more sense that she would file it in New York because, again, that's where a lot of this happened, right? She lived in New York. They filmed in Jersey. A lot of the meetings took place at their, New York penthouse. That would make sense. The CRD complaint in California, to me, never made any sense.
I do think, though, that, and we just comment on this, I do think it's interesting, though, if you file the CRD, then everything you say after that, I mean, would that be covered by the litigation privilege? Because you don't have the right to sue yet. And so it may, I mean, I don't know. I haven't done any research into that. Have you looked into that, Keith?
I actually did look up Civil Code Section 47 and 47.1 in California.
Well, look at that.
So, yeah, I know. I sound like I know what I'm talking about. And it doesn't just apply to litigation. It also applies to anything that's an official government act, like filing a report. And 47.1 in particular applies to sexual harassment claims and that sort of thing. And you're covered by the litigation privilege in California, at least, if you make a complaint, whether you file it or not. So even, if you have a complaint and you transmit it to somebody, you're covered by the litigation privilege, even if you didn't file the lawsuit or even if you didn't file the complaint. So it's a pretty broad statute.
And that's Civil Code 70, what is it?
It's Civil Code 47.1.
Hey, Zach, will you do a whole hour show on Civil Code 47.1? Can you do that for
Snooze
us?
fest.
Sounds like a blast.
Yeah. But the interesting point is, I think you're right that they were thinking, well, if we file this under the guise of a CRD complaint, we're covered by the privilege under Civil Code 47, 47.1. And then, it magically leaks. Oh, well, you can't blame us. We were doing an official complaint. Well, I think once you leaked it, I think you then stepped outside of the protection of the statute would be my thought.
Right, because his allegation is that she colluded with the New York Times to publish, and that's why he sued the New York Times first. So does he have a case against her at all for defamation with that litigation privilege?
I think he arguably does, because the question becomes, you can make an official complaint to the government and you're protected. But when you take that same information and you transmit it outside of that complaint procedure, I think you've stepped out of the protection of the statute. I think now you're just good old fashioned defamation. So I think that I think Friedman has a decent argument there, and it'll be interesting to see how the court rules on it eventually. But I like the argument. And if I had to choose, between Friedman's side or the other side, I would choose Friedman on that one.
But so, like, in defense of Blake Lively, though, she technically never went on record in the New York Times article. They just somehow magically obtained access to this. And they're not saying that Lively's team provided it. Lively's team is not, doesn't give any comment or go on record during the New York Times article at all. So there's no actual words or allegations that are coming from Blake Lively outside of the CRD complaint.
Well, but and this will be interesting to see the discovery that comes out of the New York Times litigation, because I mean, if they had to get this information from somebody, and I'm sure they had to vet it with somebody, so that's going to be an interesting look behind the curtains as to how they got all of this stuff.
Well, it's like the attorney-client privilege. If you're communicating with your lawyer, it's covered by the privilege. But if you take that communication and you give it to anybody else, it breaks the privilege. So you could give it to your friend and it's no longer covered by the attorney-client privilege, because you've now stepped outside of that, where the privilege avenue where you're protected, and you've given it to an outside source. So if they took that complaint, or one of her agents took that complaint and gave it to the New York Times, I think you've stepped outside of the protection of the statute.
Yeah.
I think you have.
So how does the New York Times play this then? Because they obviously are being sued by Baldoni, and not only are they being sued, but they, I would imagine, want to protect Blake Lively because they were complicit in, working to get this alleged narrative that they were trying to put out to taint the public against Baldoni. Because my thought was him suing them is going to lead to discovery, which will ultimately expose that they were working together. And even though she didn't officially go on record and nobody in her team officially went on record, because the New York Times at this point, in their response to Justin Baldoni, has said that there were thousands of pages that were reviewed that they vetted this information from. And the only person that could have provided that information would have been Blake Lively's team.
Yeah.
And what were the backdoor channels that were going on? What text messages were being sent back and forth? What emails? What phone calls? And then you got spoliation of evidence. If anybody destroys any of this evidence, it's going to be viewed most disfavorably towards the person who destroyed it. There's a lot going on when we get into a case like this, and obviously we don't represent people that are famous, but we always want to know what communications were taking place and between who and in what medium, and we ask for every medium. And it's painful at times when we're on the other side of those subpoenas or those discovery requests. We have to give up all the text messages, and they're brutal at times to have to give those text messages up. And Zach, people say funny things in text messages. They feel safer in text messages than they do in emails. I don't know why, but they'll say crazy things in emails too, don't get me wrong. But text messages, people really say some funny things that are very harmful. And man, you got to turn that stuff over. So it'll be interesting to know who was the point of contact or contacts at the New York Times. Was it Blake Lively herself? Was it Ryan Reynolds? Sorry, I'm coming off of pneumonia and the flu, Zach.
You're good
today. But who are the points of contact and what is being communicated back and forth? Those are all going to be interesting things to look at.
So then my counter question to that is, because obviously the New York Times, we have freedom of the press. They don't have to disclose who their sources are. So how far into discovery realistically can Baldoni's team get, considering they do have some sort of protection being the press?
They can still subpoena and go after Blake Lively's team, though. And so they don't have that privilege the way the Times does. And they know that she was the source. So I think they go after her. They issue subpoenas towards her and get it, from that angle, from that side.
Got it. And then they can see the communication from her side that goes to the New York Times that proves that her team was the one that was putting this information out there.
And
I mean, this was just the dumbest move she could have ever made.
We see this time and time again. People can't help themselves. They'll delete a text or two or 3 or 10. It's Nixon, Watergate all over again. People can't help it. They have to have a cover up. So let's see if that happens in this case as well.
Cover up's worse than the crime.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it looks way worse. I mean, even if the cover up was innocuous or like whatever was deleted was not even that bad, like it's doesn't look good.
Yeah.
No, it does not.
Yeah.
Well,
what would you guys do with if
ahead.
Blake was your client? Like, how would you handle it from here? If you realized, okay, I guess my client was not being honest with me because there's an entire website that's now been published that has all of this information against me. Like, at what point do you tell your client to fold, or how far do you keep fighting?
Can I take a quick shot at that?
Yeah.
So recently, Zach, I've changed over the last few years, and I used to just litigate everything, and you pound your chest and you litigate hard, and that's what leads to resolutions, is the pain that litigation causes.
Yeah.
But within the last 5, 6, 7 years, both Keith and I, we reach out to the other side and we try diplomacy. And I think that's what needs to happen here. If I was with Blake Lively, I would do a lot of things that you told her to do from a PR standpoint. But from a legal standpoint, we'd be reaching out to all the powers that be and all of the interests and the parties, and we would be having a private meeting, hopefully a private meeting that's not everything's leaked to the press. And we'd say, look, guys, we're all dying here. We're all bleeding here on the battlefield. What do we need to do to resolve this case? And at least that gets people talking. And once you have the lawyers talking, who are not supposed to be so passionate about the case, then we could figure out a path forward where both sides could settle. I think there would have to be a significant payment from Blake
Yeah.
Lively to Baldoni, and maybe from the New York Times. You bring all the parties together to get a global resolution because you don't want to leave pieces still litigating out there. And you want this done from the public's eye. You want it over. And then, like you say, the public has a short attention span. We're part of the public, so I'm not trying to insult anybody there. And you let a couple years go by, and then probably Blake Lively can come back and do something. And somebody will say, "Hey, wasn't that the girl that was in the?" Yeah, it was. But she's going to move on. But the settlement here is going to be a lot of money. It's going to be a big sum of money, and I think it's going to be going to Justin Baldoni. The question is he going to be willing, and it depends on the number that's being transferred to him, is he willing to sign a confidentiality agreement in that settlement agreement that basically says nobody's going to say who won here. Nobody's going to say anyone was at fault, and we're just going to settle this, and it's going to be confidential, and no one will ever talk about this again. How much extra premium does he require in that settlement in money to make it confidential? And I think that's the issue.
Well, but also just to add to that, I think the bigger issue that Blake's legal team is going to have to face is it's not just like we're looking at this as just Blake versus Baldoni, but Baldoni is not the only defendant here. So we have Justin Baldoni, we have Jamie Heath, we have Melissa Nathan, we have Jennifer Abel, and then the biggest player in this is we have Steve Sorowitz, who's the one that's financing, that we're believing is financing it because he has the deepest pockets, more than Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively. And so when it comes to a settlement, I don't think that Steve Sorowitz is looking for money because he don't need money. He's loaded and he's good. Now, is he going to be willing to settle for just the money and be willing to sign the confidentiality? Because they would all technically have to agree to this deal, right?
Yes. Yeah, they'd all have to agree. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll tell you, if I was advising Blake Lively, I'd say we got to figure out a way to shut this down and settle it before you get deposed. Because you being deposed by Friedman is going to be an absolute nightmare.
I can't wait. That is like, I'm on the edge of my seat waiting for that.
And the sad thing is, a lot of times clients think, "Oh, I wish I was deposed. I would do so good." No, you won't. You're going to do terrible. And you think you're going to do good, but you've never matched wits with somebody like Friedman, who's going to sit there and attack you from every different angle. And you're not going to come out looking good. I can promise you that.
Yeah, Zach, Keith and I are always surprised by clients who tell us they can't wait to tell the truth. They can't wait to get up on the stand. They can't wait to get in deposition. And this is well before you were probably born. You're a young guy. If you remember, there was a case called O.J. Simpson. And O.J., he was telling his dream team in the criminal case, he was telling them, put me on the stand. And of course, criminal defendants do not have to testify if they choose not to. And you can't hold that against them. There's a jury instruction that tells the jury, just because the defendant didn't get up there, you cannot hold that against them. But OJ wanted to testify because he was going to fix this. He was going to make it all right. He was going to explain to the jury everything. And Johnny Cochran, who had OJ's trust, pulled him aside and in the jailhouse and spent a whole day with him and had to talk him out of testifying. And OJ really wanted to testify because he just felt like he could make this right. Now, we do know that OJ did testify 2 years later in the civil case, and he crashed and burned. And so that's why I think Keith is saying no depositions in this case, especially from Blake Lively. It may be bad for Justin Baldoni as well, but no depositions because clients feel like they can bring something to this. 99% of the time in my career, they don't bring anything to it, and it ends up being very bad. So for somebody like you, though, Zach, I'm sure you would love to have a video deposition of Blake Lively. You could probably do 10 shows on that and more. So it remains to be seen how far this gets down the road.
I mean, listen, I'm loving just her text messages alone. That is juicy in and of itself, let alone a video deposition. But we see that she was fighting against having Brian Friedman depose her. So, which to me, I read these as delay tactics, right? They want to, fight for, they don't want him to depose her because they think that he's biased against her. They want the extension. But to me, it just seems like it's a lot of smoke and mirrors, tricks and games that they're trying to do, which to me tells me they don't have a strong case.
Yeah, they've been dealt a bad hand for sure. And they probably didn't fully understand that. But, now they do. And that happens. I mean, as lawyers, we've all had cases where you think it's a good case, and then all of a sudden you get clobbered with something that the other side presents, and you're like, boy, I wish I would have known that before. But there you have it.
So, a question about because now we see that she's trying to subpoena all of the messages dating back 2.5 years. Now, I don't believe that I don't believe the judge will authorize that or approve it. But with that, my own speculation is that she's doing this not to get any sort of information or evidence that can help her case, but to possibly find some dirt against Baldoni and the other defendants that they could then use to strong arm his legal team by saying, listen, we have these text messages that look a little off color if they get leaked to page 6, right? It looks like maybe you weren't the biggest supporter of this social cause that, you claim to. I mean, you're not the biggest feminist. You called this woman this name or whatever it is. And if this leaks to page 6, this is going to tank your reputation and your brand of being this male feminist, right? So my thought is they're probably trying to just dig up dirt so that they can have some sort of bargaining chip at the table.
Yeah, and they're probably hoping that even if they don't get all the documents, they're hoping that Baldoni has something in there that he's afraid of.
Yeah.
And so if I subpoena his file and he knows something I don't, but he's afraid of it, and then I start getting pushback, I'm going to keep pushing harder and harder and harder because I'm thinking, oh, there must be something there. And they're probably hoping that there's text between Baldoni and his producing partner. Maybe they've sent text back and forth about, what a horrible person this is and made off-color comments, and they're hoping to find something there. Those subpoenas will most likely get restricted. I mean, most judges are not going to let you just get 2.5 years of unrestricted text messages between Baldoni and everybody in the world. But they're probably hoping that there's something there. It's a Hail Mary. I mean, they don't know.
Yeah.
But
2.5 years ago was before she was even cast in the film. That's what they're saying that they want these text messages to prove the smear campaign, but like the alleged smear campaign didn't happen until last summer, which is a lot closer than 2.5. Like the scope is just so wide.
Yeah, lawyers always do that, though. They always start with a ridiculous scope, and then you have to argue about it and narrow it down.
But the scope of discovery that's allowed in California and I'm sure in New York is anything, and it's anything that could lead to the introduction of relevant evidence. So it is a very broad scope, and I don't think 2.5 years that's not too far. We generally get 5 and 10 years in many cases, but the distinction here is, I think a judge will limit it. It has to be relevant to this case. And so it's not going to be his text message where, he says, I don't like this particular race of people or something like that. Not that he said that, but it's just that would not be something that would have to be produced because it's not likely to lead to the discovery of relevant evidence. And so I think there's some games that'll be played here. The good news is you have a federal judge. And again, they don't play around. And they don't let these games get played by either side. And if there are relevant text messages out there, Baldoni's going to have to produce them. And I will say his case is not perfect. There is not a perfect case. His team knows where the Achilles heels are for him. They don't sound like they're as big of Achilles heels as they are for Blake Lively's side. But there's no perfect case. There's always things we as lawyers are worried about for our clients. Even when we have the best client out of everybody in a case, there's still issues we worry about. So there's 2 things here. Number one, I would fight back if I was Baldoni's lawyer and say, no, this is just too broad. It's a witch hunt. It's a fishing expedition. They're just trying to find anything they can. And then it probably ends up with the judge saying anything that has to do with Blake Lively in any way, shape, or form, that has to be produced.
Right.
Do you think it's within the realm of possibility to get her lawsuit against him dismissed, given that they haven't really provided a real solid case or any evidence to even, like, I don't know what the rules would be out of the Supreme Court in New York, but, or not Supreme Court, but
Federal court, yeah.
Federal court, yes. Federal court out of New York. I don't know what they would have to bring to the table in order to move forward with the lawsuit, but is it possible that he can get her case thrown out? Because as of right now, it doesn't really sound like she has a case.
It would be very difficult, almost impossible. Okay. And it's because at the beginning of a case, all you need to do is make allegations. And if you have allegations, it doesn't matter what the evidence is. All that matters is the allegations. The evidence is tested come time of trial. So they're not going to be able to get it dismissed probably, but they're going to have to see this through the process. And then the evidence will be tested if it ever goes to trial.
But you will see both sides file motions to dismiss. It happens almost in every case. I think it's a motion B12 or something like that in federal court.
Yeah.
And it'll be and not granted by the court, and the case will continue. And the great thing about those motions is there's going to be a lot of information in there that'll be good for people that are consuming this from a media standpoint. Actually, that led to my next question. How big is this story for you, Zach? I mean, you've been covering all kinds of pop culture for a long time. It seems like people are really, really interested in this case.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably one of the biggest. I mean, outside of Scandival, which was like the big cheating scandal on Vanderpump Rules, which has now led to its own lawsuit, which is now, I believe, should that move forward, is going to trial this November. But outside of that, this has to be one of the biggest scandals that I've covered. And I really think it's because you have two big names like Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds that were this beloved couple that people really, and people were always saying Blake and Ryan are couples goals, and Ryan Reynolds has just continued to kind of catapult into this A-list celebrity status now that he's attached himself to the Marvel brand and has become Deadpool. And so I think people love a good takedown of a big celebrity. They love a juicy scandal. And two, I think the more we dig into this case legally, the more we see that it doesn't look like Blake Lively has a strong case. And if anything, maybe fabricating a lot of this information that she alleges in her complaint. And so I think people are just salivating at how juicy it's been. I mean, I've had people that were like, at first they didn't care. They were so annoyed by all of this. And then once the text messages started to come out, once the details started to leak and the footage was out there, then they were immediately hooked. And now people are really on the edge of their seats wanting updates on this case.
Yeah, that's definitely where I was at. Like in the beginning, it was like, who cares? And now it's like, I can't get enough.
So was I. I mean, I did not care about this case at all when it first, because it was Christmas when this all came out. And I was like, and I had a friend, her name is Donna Bowling, also covering the Baldoni stuff extensively. And she was sending me the complaint. She's like, you need to read this. It's so juicy. It's so crazy. And I was like, I don't care about this. And she's like, no, you have to read it. I finally read it. And then that's when I was like, oh, I have some questions. There are some red flags here. And then she was like, absolutely not. You don't believe her. Like, look at what she's claiming. And I was like, yes, and that's when it really clicked for me, was when I saw how much she took everything that was written in the complaint as fact. And that's when I was like, oh, this is a PR strategy, because they know that every Donna that's able to download this PDF is going to then believe all of these things, because, why would somebody file a complaint or a lawsuit, which is how it was being reported in the media, was that this was a lawsuit, not a CRD complaint. Who would think that she would be lying about any of this?
Right. Yeah. It looked like it was the truth.
Yeah.
Crazy.
I mean, and why would you, like, who would question that truth aside from, me, who spotted red flags and was willing and is not afraid to say that on the internet.
Right.
And I take my whippings accordingly, but I usually tend to be on the right side of things when they fully play out, such as like the Girardi case. And so I'm, very much looking forward to seeing how this plays out.
Yeah.
Zach, you've been very, very kind to spend the time with us today. Just real quickly, are you in Los Angeles?
Yes.
Were you affected by the fires? You doing okay?
I live in downtown, so I wasn't too close. I had family and friends that were closer to the fires, but luckily, we're able to stay safe during that time.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And all your friends and family, everybody good?
Yes.
Okay. I saw the rains came and of course they're causing mudslides now because of all the burning. But yeah,
I know.
Yeah, LA's been going through a lot. So,
yeah.
But hey, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we can do this again. An exciting story, and as it develops, we'll continue to look at it from a legal standpoint.
Yes, I would love to have you guys on the show next week. So we'll have to set that up and let everybody know that I'll have a lot more. I'll think on it and come up with a lot more questions for you guys.
All right. We'll be on our game. We'll be ready. Thanks a lot, Zach.